My number 7 best chess game of the 1920s is Reti vs. Lasker from New York, 1924. 3 years previously, Lasker had lost his long-held world championship title to Capablanca, and many considered that his greatest years were behind him. But here, in New York 1924, he finished decisively and spectacularly in first place, ahead of Capablanca in second place and Alekhine in third place. Many have commented that the top 3 spots here mirrored the Great St. Petersburg Tournament of 1914, 1 decade previously. Now, there were many great games in this event, and Reti won some of the finest, including his Brilliancy Prize victory over Bogolyubov and a victory with the incredibly hypermodern Reti opening against Capablanca in round 5. In round 16, he tries the same opening against Lasker and gets a good opening result, but Lasker, ever the great fighter, turns the tables, winning what he considered his finest victory in this event. As Vladimir Kramnik was wont to do many decades later, Reti begins with one knight to f3. From here we see d5, c4, c6, and b3. For me, this is kind of the definitive start to the Reti setup, and that's because this is the setup I first saw when introduced to the opening by an Eric Schiller book, not necessarily an auspicious beginning. I remember seeing a setup with a3, rook a2, bishop to b2, and queen to a1, setting up batteries on both the file and on the diagonal. I don't know that this kind of cramped I'm going to put all of my pieces in the corner setup is really highly recommended, but it works spectacularly in the example game, and I certainly tried to achieve a similar setup and replicate that success in a number of my own games. Now, this setup with you putting everything in the corner is a bit extreme, but Reti's going to do something similar in this game. He's a leading proponent of the hypermodern school of chess at the time, and one of the things that they said is you don't necessarily need to occupy the center with your pawns. You can hang back and attack the center with your pieces. This is an effective strategy, but it is just one tool in your strategic toolbox, and when the opportunity presents itself, you should choose other strategies, maybe attacking in the center. Reti is going to miss these kinds of opportunities in this game, but he's also going to see some success with the hypermodern strategy and baffle Lasker at critical points. Now, from here we see bishop f5, g3, knight to f6, bishop g2, knight b to d7, bishop to b2, pawn to e6, castles, bishop d6, d3, castles, and knight b to d2. Lasker has gone for a triangle setup, one of the most solid and trusty setups that you can pick against almost any hypermodern opening. It's just as good today as it was in 1924. If you don't want to learn theory, you can just go for a triangle setup. The problem, though, is what do you do in a position like this? The human instinct is to be active, but the triangle setup is all about solidity. And Lasker here goes for activity, rejecting solidity. For example, the computer recommends a move like bishop g6, doing almost nothing. And now with pawn to e5, he gets into a bit of trouble. Reti seizes on the right first move. Pawn takes d5. You can't capture back with the piece even if you wanted to strategically because you lose a piece to this pawn fork. So after pawn takes d5, we see pawn takes d5. And now the problem is that the e5 advance has softened the long diagonal and this pawn right here. And Reti could have taken advantage if he now stepped away from his hypermodern idea of attacking the center with the pieces and attacked the center with a pawn instead. Pawn to e4 here and on a number of the subsequent moves was very strong. This advance is going to open lines for basically all of the white pieces and especially the bishops. One problem for Lasker is tactical vulnerability, particularly on the d file here. The loose bishop on d6 will be a big problem if you try to win a pawn on e4, because after pawn takes e4, you're hit here and you're hit here, and you simply lose one bishop. So unfortunately for Reti, he doesn't seize this opportunity and strike out with e4. Instead, he plays a natural move, rook c1. We see queen to e7, we see rook c2, we see a5. Lasker is going to play like Bent Larsen and like Alpha Zero at multiple points in this game, and when not sure what to do, he's going to push a rook pawn to good effect. After a5, we see pawn to a4, which is an overreaction to the advance of black's a5 pawn. The two advances are not identical. Black has not really created a weakness by advancing a5. However, white does have a weakness on b3, and this is going to be a problem later in the game. After a4, we see pawn to h6, queen to a1, a very interesting move. I like this move a lot. I really do love the long diagonal here and the battery that exists on this diagonal. For those who like long diagonal batteries, this is a great game. After queen a1, we see rook f to e8 supporting the e5 pawn, rook fc1 occupying the only open file. This seems like it should be a very successful setup here for Reti, but it's actually not the case. The problem with occupying the c-file, doubling on the c-file here, is that there are no targets and no points of invasion, and without those, an open file is often relatively useless. Here now we see bishop back to h7, knight f1, and knight c5. There are serious problems here with the b3 pawn. So although Reti had his opportunities, particularly around the move pawn to e4, at this point Lasker has effectively consolidated his advantage. His pawn center is very secure. White's pieces, Reti's pieces, are not really putting pressure on the pawn center in any way, and black has a very large advantage. Therefore, Reti takes some radical measures here with rook takes c5, an exchange sacrifice. The computer likes this okay, in that it doesn't really like any of white's options, but this is one of its top choices. And on a practical level, I think this is definitely the way to go. It's much easier to sacrifice the exchange here and free your pieces rather than to sit passively and just kind of wait to be rolled over. After bishop takes c5, we see knight takes c5. We are getting open lines for both of the bishops, and that's quite nice. Unfortunately, we're also opening, for example, the e-file for black's pieces as well. Rook ac8, knight to e3, and either on this move or after the played moves queen e6 and h3, I really think that the most simple and effective strategy for Lasker was just to take on e3. You are giving up the bishop pair, but you're permanently softening a lot of the squares and the pawns in the white position. I think this is a position where Lasker can really be the only one to win the game. Instead, though, he goes for bishop to d6, and now there is now a big opportunity for Reti. He starts correctly, a trade on c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, but now he should go for knight 5 to g4. And annotators after the game correctly noted that in this position, knight takes g4, bishop takes d5 is a very strong intermediate move and leads to a nearly winning position for white. And you don't really have a good alternative because you're getting crushed on this long diagonal here after the knight was pulled back to g4. The long diagonal and the weakness of d5 give Reti huge opportunities to win the game. Instead, though, he played a more timid move, knight to f3. A very, very solid position for white, and one which Reti probably shouldn't lose, but he does miss the one opportunity he had to maybe win the game. After knight f3, we see bishop e7, knight to d4 hitting the queen, which pulls back to d7, king h2, and as I already indicated, Lasker's now going to go for the Larsen/AlphaZero approach. When you don't know what to do, push a rook pawn, h5. h4 is a great idea here, and you don't want to play h4 for white because that's going to soften the g4 square right here. Queen to h1. Once again, I really love the setup here, and another battery here on the long diagonal. After queen h1, we see h4, knight takes d5, winning a pawn, but allowing an extremely softened position for the white king, and generally for the white position kind of across the board. There are a lot of very tempting weak squares for black to attack. Now, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and bishop f6. Pressure on the long diagonal, pressure on the d-file. In this position, the computer indicates that there's only one move that really works. It's queen to f3, and honestly, this move, I don't even know that I can say that I get it. I think it's really a stockfish move. It's just consolidating the position. It seems to hold everything together. It responds to ideas like rook c2 in some lines and then bishop takes d3 and some other lines. It also supports the bishop here and supports the possible pawn to e4 in some positions as well. It's just good enough to hold on against Black's many active ideas. Unfortunately for Reti, he doesn't find this very computer-like move, and instead he plays the move bishop takes b7, picking up a pawn. Very, very natural, also attacking the rook. But in this position, Lasker's pieces are going to leap out to active squares, and they're going to control the game. From here on, I think that Lasker plays pretty close to perfectly. We get rook c5. We get bishop a6. Now there is one long diagonal check here that you have to watch out for, but simply bishop g6 and the king can now step to h7. The queen goes into b7, offering a queen trade, and for the moment Lasker rejects that. Queen to d8, now b4, and now rook c7, queen b6, and rook d7, piling up on the d file, and in this position forcing the queen trade. The queen trade has only become better for Lasker. After queen takes d8, rook takes d8, the pressure here forces the only move, pawn to e3. After pawn e3, we get a takes b4, and if I showed this position to a lot of people, I think a number of them might suggest that white is better here. I mean, it's not crazy to me to consider that. White does have two passed pawns, and a lot of people do like having an exchange, with two pawns against a rook. You might also think that maybe the a pawn is the best passed pawn on the board and the b pawn looks pretty thoroughly blockaded. To flip the perspective though, all of Black's pieces, the bishops and the rook, are more active than the white counterparts, and they have very, very effective targets in the position. Additionally, the b pawn turns out to not be the most ineffective passed pawn on the board, and as a result of all of these factors, Lasker is effectively winning, as he demonstrates with great play. King g2, bishop takes d4. Now, after bishop takes d4, I really wanted to play rook takes d4, sacrificing an exchange and then queening this pawn. You do get to queen the pawn, but you don't win the game. After pawn takes d4, b3, bishop c4, b2, bishop a2, bishop takes d3, you're going to win this bishop by promoting this pawn, but white is going to have two pawns against your bishop, and it's going to distract your bishop, and white will have enough counterplay to draw the game. The computer says 0.00. Of course, on a human level, there's a lot to still be figured out, but I'm just going to leave it at 0.00 according to the computer. Instead, after bishop takes d4, though, you can just prepare the advance of the b pawn with, for example, bishop f5, and then after king f3, you could play b3, and then after bishop c4, you don't go for this. You instead just play bishop e6 here, and the b pawn is going to be unstoppable. There's still the idea of rook takes d4 in an improved position, and Black is just winning. So we don't get this though. After bishop takes d4, seeing I think these lines, we see pawn takes d4 instead. Unfortunately, this really makes this bishop permanently bad, and once you get here, I think that people would be correct to start talking about this being a matter of technique. And of course, Lasker has great technique. We get bishop f5, bishop to b7, bishop to e6, supporting the pawn's further advance. King f3, bishop to b3, tickling this pawn right here. If the pawn advances, a nice move is bishop to d5 check. And after the forced exchange of bishops, this pawn right here is lost, and we have a technically winning position for Black. Instead, though, after bishop b3, we see bishop c6, defending the pawn right here. And now rook d6 tickling the bishop pulls back. We get some rook checks tickling the king, and then after king f4, we now invade with rook e2. This bishop is a bit humiliated, a bit embarrassed. We get bishop c1, rook c2, pushing the bishop away, so this pawn can now advance. All you need to do to push the pawn is move your bishop, which is done with bishop d5, and in this position, Reti resigned, having no way to meet b3, b2, b1 equals queen. This is a great fight from one of the great tournaments of the 1920s, and it perfectly demonstrates some of the chess philosophy at play here in the hypermodern school of chess, and some of the styles of Reti and Lasker. Reti being the great hypermodern genius, and Lasker being the great fighter. I hope that you've enjoyed this game as much as I have. To see more of my favorite games of the 1920s, including games from Capablanca, Nimzovich, and many more, simply click on the playlist that is popping up on the screen as I speak.